The windshield wipers were losing their battle against the rain. Marcus Reed leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the deluge as his 12-year-old Toyota struggled against the wind that threatened to push it off the rural highway. The clock on the dashboard read 10:47, and he was already late. He was always late these days, running from one job to the next, trying to hold together a life that seemed determined to fall apart. His phone sat in the cup holder, dark and silent. Sophie had stopped calling him after 9 o'clock, having learned that Daddy's late nights were just part of their life now. She was 8 years old and already too understanding, too mature, too willing to eat her chicken nuggets alone at the kitchen table while her father scrambled to make enough money to keep the lights on. The thought made Marcus's chest tighten with a familiar guilt that never quite went away. He worked 2 jobs now. The construction gig during the day barely covered rent, and the night shifts at the warehouse paid for everything else: food, utilities, the modest birthday presents he couldn't afford but bought anyway because he needed Sophie to know she was loved. He needed her to know that even though her mother had walked out 2 years ago without so much as a goodbye note, even though the world seemed intent on proving that single fathers from the wrong side of town couldn't make it work, she was his whole world and he would fight heaven and earth to give her a good life. The custody hearing was in 3 days. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone. Sarah, his ex-wife, had reappeared 6 months ago with a new husband, a new house in the suburbs, and a new determination to take Sophie away from him. She had a lawyer who wore suits that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. She had character witnesses who would testify that she'd gotten clean, found stability, turned her life around. She had everything except the 2 years she'd spent absent from their daughter's life while Marcus had been the one braiding hair for school pictures and sitting up through midnight fevers and learning how to cook something other than bachelor food because his little girl needed vegetables and normalcy and love. His lawyer, a kind-eyed public defender named Janet who took his case pro bono because she believed in him, had been honest about his chances. The system favored mothers, she'd said gently. Especially mothers who had rehabilitated themselves and could provide a stable 2-parent home. The fact that Marcus had been the stable one all along, the one who never left, the one who showed up every single day even when he was exhausted and broke and scared, that might not be enough. The judge would look at Sophie's best interests, and on paper, a house in the suburbs with 2 parents and financial security looked a lot better than a 1-bedroom apartment where Dad was never home because he was working himself into the ground. Marcus had been angry at first, then terrified. Now he was just numb, going through the motions, showing up to work and showing up for Sophie and trying not to think about what would happen if he lost her. She was all he had. She was everything. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof of the car like it had a personal grudge. Marcus considered pulling over to wait it out, but he was already running behind and Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor who watched Sophie on these late nights, had her own family to get home to. He pressed forward, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes straining against the darkness. That's when he saw her. At first, it was just a shape on the side of the road, a dark silhouette barely visible through the rain. Then his headlights caught the reflective surface of a car pulled onto the narrow shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly. A figure stood beside it, wavering slightly, like they might collapse at any moment. Marcus's first instinct was to keep driving. It was late, he was tired, and stopping for strangers on deserted highways was exactly the kind of thing that ended badly in horror movies. But even as the thought crossed his mind, his foot was already moving to the brake. His father had raised him better than that. You help people, his dad had said 1,000 times before the heart attack took him when Marcus was 17. You help people because that's what decent human beings do, and the world needs more decent human beings. He pulled over about 20 feet past the stranded car and put on his own hazards. The rain was coming down so hard now that it sounded like gravel being poured onto the roof. He grabbed the spare jacket from his back seat, a threadbare thing that had seen better days but was better than nothing, and pushed open the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The rain was freezing, October in the Midwest, and the temperature had dropped fast after sunset. He jogged back toward the figure, holding the jacket over his head in a futile attempt to stay dry. As he got closer, he could make out more details. It was a woman, tall and slender, wearing what had probably been an expensive coat before it got soaked through. She was leaning heavily against her car, a sleek silver sedan that looked as out of place on this rural highway as its owner did. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and even in the poor light, Marcus could see that she was shivering violently. "Hey," he called out over the sound of the rain. "You okay?" She turned toward him, and he saw her face properly for the first time. She was in her mid-40s maybe, with sharp features softened by exhaustion and what looked like pain. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, and for a moment, he saw fear flash across her face. A woman alone on a dark road, approached by a stranger. He understood immediately and held up both hands, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, raising his voice to be heard. "I just saw you were stranded and wanted to help. Do you need a ride somewhere? Your car break down?" She nodded, then seemed to think better of it. "Flat tire," she managed through chattering teeth. "I called for help but there's no tow service that can come until morning." "The storm." She gestured vaguely at the sky, as if the deluge needed introduction. "You can't stay out here," Marcus said, stating the obvious. "You'll freeze. Come on, I can give you a ride to town. There's a motel about 15 miles up the road." She hesitated, and he saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. Stranger danger versus hypothermia. It was the same risk assessment he'd considered in reverse just minutes ago. "I have a daughter," he added, not sure why that seemed like relevant information but hoping it might help. "She's 8. I'm just trying to get home to her." "I'm not. I'm just a guy who stops when people need help." That's all. Something in his voice must have convinced her, or maybe she was just too cold and tired to care anymore about the risks. She pushed off from the car with visible effort and took a step toward him, then another. On the third step, her legs seemed to give out entirely. Marcus moved on instinct, catching her before she hit the ground. She was heavier than she looked, dead weight in his arms, and he realized with alarm that she wasn't just cold, she was sick. He could feel the heat radiating off her even through her wet clothes. Okay, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Change of plans. He half carried, half dragged her to his car, getting the passenger door open and maneuvering her inside. She was barely conscious now, mumbling something he couldn't make out. He cranked the heat as high as it would go and pulled back onto the highway, driving faster than he should have but not as fast as the panic rising in his chest wanted him to. She needed a hospital, but the nearest one was 40 minutes away in good weather, probably over an hour in this storm. The motel was closer, and at least there he could get her warm and dry and call for help. He glanced over at her every few seconds, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest, praying she wouldn't stop breathing before he could get her somewhere safe. "Stay with me," he said, reaching over to shake her shoulder gently. "Come on, stay awake. What's your name?" "Rebecca," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. "Rebecca Hale." "Okay, Rebecca, I'm Marcus. You're going to be fine. We're going to get you somewhere warm." She didn't respond, and Marcus pressed down harder on the gas pedal. The motel appeared out of the rain like a mirage, a squat building with a flickering neon sign that read, "Valley View Inn," though there was no valley and definitely no view. Marcus pulled up as close to the office as he could and ran inside, leaving Rebecca in the running car with the heat blasting. The night clerk was a teenage kid who looked up from his phone with the expression of someone deeply inconvenienced by having to do his job. "Need a room?" "Yeah, and I need you to call an ambulance. I've got a woman in my car. She's sick, she's got a fever and she collapsed on the side of the road." That got the kid's attention. He scrambled for the phone while Marcus grabbed a room key and went back out to the car. Rebecca was unconscious now, her head lolled back against the seat, her breathing rapid and shallow. Marcus scooped her up, surprised again by how light she was despite her height, and carried her through the rain to room 12. The room was exactly what he'd expected, cheap and dated but blessedly warm. He laid Rebecca on the bed and started pulling off her wet coat, trying to be respectful but knowing that leaving her in wet clothes would only make things worse. He found a spare blanket in the closet and wrapped it around her, then grabbed some towels from the bathroom to dry her hair as best he could. The ambulance took 25 minutes to arrive. Marcus spent that time sitting in the chair by the bed, watching Rebecca breathe and thinking about Sophie asleep at home, about Mrs. Chen who was probably wondering where he was, about the construction shift he had to work in 6 hours, about the custody hearing that loomed over everything like a guillotine waiting to drop. He thought about the kind of person who stops in a storm to help a stranger, and the kind of person who drives past. He'd always tried to be the former, but lately, the weight of just surviving made it harder to think about anyone beyond himself and Sophie. Tonight had been instinct, muscle memory from the man his father had raised him to be. He hoped that still counted for something. The paramedics were professional and efficient. They loaded Rebecca onto a stretcher, asked Marcus some basic questions about how he'd found her, and then they were gone, red lights disappearing into the rain. The night clerk appeared in the doorway. "You want to keep the room? Already paid for it." Marcus looked at his watch. It was past midnight. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." He called Mrs. Chen and apologized profusely, promised he'd pay her extra, assured her everything was fine. Then he called the warehouse and told them he was sick, hating himself for the lie but knowing he couldn't function on no sleep. He'd already lost the night's wages, and missing the shift would probably get him written up, but there was nothing to be done about it now. He stretched out on the bed where Rebecca had been, still in his damp clothes, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He thought about the woman he'd just saved, wondered who she was beyond a name, whether she had people who were worried about her, whether she'd remember any of this in the morning. He thought about the universe and its timing, about how we cross paths with thousands of people in a lifetime and most of them mean nothing, just faces in a crowd, extras in the background of our own personal movies. But every once in a while, there's someone who changes everything, though we usually don't know it at the time. Marcus Reed fell asleep in a cheap motel room on the night before everything changed, with no idea that the stranger he'd saved would soon hold his entire future in her hands. Fate works in strange ways, his father used to say. Sometimes it works in storms.